The year is 1560. Somewhere in the mountains of Ichigo province, a young samurai kneels before his lord, presses a folded letter into his sleeve, and says nothing. The letter is a pledge, not of loyalty in battle, a pledge of the heart. In feudal Japan, this was not scandal, it was custom, it had a name, and for nearly 1,000 years, it was written into the very code of the warrior class. This is the story of a life most textbooks never mention. A life of devotion, danger, and identity, lived openly in one era and violently erased in another. A life where love between men was not hidden in shadows, but sanctified in temples, painted onto silk screens, and sung about in poetry recited at court. Let's go back. Feudal Japan did not divide desire the way the modern West does. There was no single word for gay or straight, because the culture simply did not organize people that way. What mattered was not who you loved, but how you loved them, and within what social order. Among the samurai class, there existed a formalized tradition known as shudō, the way of the youth. It paired an older warrior, the ninja, with a younger apprentice, the wakashu, a young man who had come of age but had not yet completed the rites into full adult samurai status. This was not a hidden subculture. It was written about, painted, celebrated in poetry, and in many domains, expected as part of a young warrior's education. Loyalty, discipline, martial skill, and yes, romantic devotion between men were bound together in the same moral universe. Picture it, a castle town at dusk. Lanterns lit along a wooden corridor. A senior retainer, scarred from 3 campaigns, waits by a screen door for a young man barely out of his teenage rites of passage, a warrior in training, sworn to him not just as student, but as beloved. Their bond was sealed with something called a shudō pledge, a formal vow of exclusive devotion, sometimes literally signed in blood, promising fidelity, protection, and loyalty unto death. Break that vow, and it wasn't just heartbreak, it was dishonor. It could end in a blade drawn in earnest. Here's what should stop you cold. This wasn't underground. It wasn't whispered about in back rooms. Some of the most powerful warlords in Japanese history, men whose names still echo in castles and shrines today, were open participants in relationships with other men, alongside wives, alongside heirs, without contradiction in the eyes of their society. Buddhist monasteries had their own version of these relationships between monks and acolytes. Kabuki theater built entire aesthetics around beautiful young male actors who were, in effect, celebrated public figures of romantic and erotic admiration from audiences of any gender. This was a civilization that, for centuries, simply did not treat male-male love as a moral crisis. So why don't we know this? Why does the image of the samurai that reaches the modern world look like stoic, sexless discipline? Bushido reduced to a poster in a martial arts studio? That question is the real mystery here. And the answer involves shame, empire, and the deliberate rewriting of a warrior class's most intimate history. Let's build the world properly, because context is everything. Japan under the samurai was not one continuous, unchanging society. It stretched from roughly the 12th century to the mid-1800s, through civil wars, unification, and 2.5 centuries of enforced peace under the Tokugawa shogunate. Confucian ideas of hierarchy structured everything: lord and vassal, parent and child, elder and younger. Shudō mapped onto that same structure. The older man was mentor, protector, sometimes literally the one who trained the boy in swordsmanship and court etiquette. The bond was not seen as effeminate or shameful, in fact quite the opposite. It was framed as one of the purest expressions of loyalty a warrior could offer, arguably even more noble than relationships with women, because it was said to be free of the impurity some Confucian and Buddhist thinkers associated with female sexuality. Let that sink in for a moment. In parts of feudal Japanese thought, love between men was considered the more refined, more spiritually elevated form of devotion. Religious institutions reinforced this too. Some Buddhist traditions held that the practice had divine origin, claiming it was taught to humanity by monks who brought the custom from the mainland centuries earlier. Whether or not that origin story is literal history, what matters is the function it served. It gave shudō religious legitimacy. This wasn't a tolerated deviation. It was, in certain periods and certain domains, woven into the moral fabric of what it meant to be a good man. Consider how deeply this reached into daily life. Etiquette manuals for young samurai included guidance on how a wakashu should dress, how he should wear his forelock, how he should carry himself, to signal both his availability for courtship and his continued innocence before his coming-of-age rite. Poetry anthologies included verses composed by warriors for their young companions, verses meant to be read aloud, shared among peers, admired rather than concealed. Some domains even had informal customs, where a young page's romantic attentions were treated as a mark of prestige. To be desired by an accomplished warrior was, in certain circles, a form of social capital, not shame. A father might even take quiet pride in knowing his son had caught the eye of a respected senior retainer, understanding it as an avenue toward mentorship, connection, and advancement within the clan. Now, here's the tension, because nothing this old, this widespread, survives without contradiction and danger. 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa peace meant something the samurai class had never truly faced before. Warriors with no wars to fight. Bureaucrats in armor. And into that vacuum came new anxieties, new rules, and new fault lines around love, loyalty, and jealousy. Because remember, the shudō bond was framed as exclusive. Betrayal was not just personal humiliation. It could be lethal. There are recorded incidents, chronicled in period writing, of jealousy between rival suitors for a young man's devotion, escalating into duels, into feuds between samurai houses, into blood on temple steps. One of the most famous literary works of the era, Ihara Saikaku's 17th century collection, The Great Mirror of Male Love, compiled dozens of these stories, some clearly moralistic fiction, some drawn from real domain records, cataloguing love, jealousy, loyalty, and tragedy between samurai and their young companions with the same seriousness a Western writer might give to grand heterosexual romance. These were bestsellers. Popular entertainment, not confessions extracted under shame. Think about what that means. In the same century that parts of Europe were executing men for sodomy under both church and state law, Japan was publishing popular fiction anthologies that treated devotion between men as a subject worthy of high literature, romance, tragedy, and moral instruction, sold openly in the same shops as travel guides and cookbooks. But here's the twist that most people miss entirely. Acceptance was never the same as equality, and cultural normalization was never the same as personal safety, because within this same system existed a devastating asymmetry. The wakashu was, by definition, temporary. A young man's status as a wakashu ended when he underwent his coming-of-age ceremony, cut his forelock, and became a full adult samurai, expected to marry, produce heirs, and often take on a wakashu of his own in turn. The romantic bond that once defined his identity was expected to end, transform, or quietly fade the moment he crossed into full adulthood. Imagine loving someone with total devotion, sealed in a blood oath, knowing that the calendar itself was working against you, knowing that your beloved's own body, his own rite of passage, would one day dissolve the bond society itself had sanctified. This is where the real emotional core of this story lives. Not in scandal, in impermanence, in watching a devotion that was publicly celebrated be quietly expected to expire. Some men resisted that expiration. History remembers a handful who refused the neat transition, who maintained devotion to a former nenja or wakashu well past the socially expected point, who chose loyalty to a person over loyalty to a life stage. These men existed at the edges of acceptability, tolerated, sometimes admired for their romantic constancy, sometimes quietly pitied, occasionally punished if their devotion clashed with duty to a clan, a marriage, or a lord's political interests. Because make no mistake, even in this most permissive era, the samurai's first loyalty was never truly his own to give. It belonged to his lord, his clan, his family line. Love of any kind was always secondary to duty. That was the real danger lurking beneath even the most celebrated shudō bond, not moral condemnation. Political inconvenience. A love affair that disrupted alliances, delayed marriages, or created factional jealousy within a domain could be ended by a lord's command, no different than a piece being removed from a game board. There's a particular kind of quiet cruelty in that arrangement, one worth sitting with for a moment. It is one thing to love in secret, hiding from a hostile world that has declared your feelings illegal or immoral. It is another thing entirely to love in the open, with society's full blessing, only to discover that the blessing itself has an expiration date built into the calendar of your own life. The wakashu was never told to be ashamed of his devotion. He was simply told, gently but firmly, that it belonged to a season of his life that would end, whether he was ready or not. So picture our composite warrior now, because no single surviving record gives us a complete life story, but the pattern across dozens of domain chronicles, temple records, and literary accounts lets us reconstruct what such a life likely felt like. A young man enters a lord's service in his early teens as a page. He is paired, as was custom, with an older retainer for both martial training and companionship. Over years, admiration deepens into devotion. A pledge is made. He fights beside his mentor in skirmishes, nurses him through injury, shares quarters, shares a life that, in every meaningful emotional sense, mirrors what we would today call a marriage, minus the modern language to name it as such. Then comes his genpuku, his coming of age. Society expects the bond to end. But it doesn't, not fully. He is now expected to marry, to produce an heir, to take on his own young protégé. And here the quiet tragedy sets in, because he now must build an entirely separate public life, a household, a wife, children, political duty, while his private loyalty remains anchored somewhere. The new social order says it no longer belongs. He is not persecuted for this in the way we might expect from European history of the same century. There's no inquisition, no execution for sodomy waiting in the wings, at least not yet. But he lives divided, two lives under one top knot, a public duty and a private truth, both entirely legitimate within his culture's own logic, and yet never fully able to occupy the. Perhaps he keeps a small token from his years as a wakashu tucked away in a lacquered box, a folded letter, a lock of hair, a poem written in a hand he still recognizes decades later. Perhaps, on campaign, far from his household duties, he finds himself thinking of a companion long since married off to duty of his own, wondering if the same memory ever crosses that man's mind on quiet nights in a distant province. This is not the stuff of legal record. It rarely made it into official chronicles, but it is the texture of a life lived across two incompatible expectations, both sanctioned, both sincere, and both ultimately unable to fully coexist. This is the injustice that rarely gets named, because it doesn't look like the persecution we're taught to recognize. No secret arrests, no burning at the stake, just a quiet, permanent architecture of expectation that made a man's most devoted bond structurally temporary by design, decade after decade, generation after generation, for centuries. Now, the turning point. Not for one man, but for an entire tradition. By the mid-1800s, Japan's isolation ended. American gunboats forced open its ports, and with foreign trade came foreign ideas, including Victorian-era Western sexual morality, imported alongside steamships and rifles. The Meiji government, desperate to be taken seriously as a modern nation among European empires, began systematically westernizing Japanese law, education, and public morality, and one of the quiet casualties of that modernization campaign was shudō itself. Within a few decades, what had been openly documented, celebrated in literature, illustrated in woodblock prints, and practiced by shoguns and peasants alike, was recast by the new government as backward, shameful, an embarrassment to be scrubbed from the national story. Samurai class relationships between men, once framed as among the purest expressions of loyalty a warrior could offer, were reclassified under new legal and social codes borrowed almost wholesale from Western Christian morality as deviant. Textbooks stopped mentioning it. Illustrated woodblock prints depicting these relationships were destroyed or hidden away in private collections. An entire dimension of 1,000 years of Japanese warrior culture was, within a single generation, edited out of the national memory. Consider the speed of that transformation. A tradition that had survived civil wars, dynastic collapses, famine, and foreign invasion attempts, a tradition woven into religion, literature, and the warrior code itself, was unmade not by centuries of gradual change, but by a single generation of bureaucrats eager to look civilized in the eyes of London and Washington. Laws were rewritten, school curriculums were revised, public morality campaigns quietly discouraged the open discussion of what had, only decades earlier, been unremarkable. Here's the twist that should genuinely unsettle you. It wasn't foreign conquest that erased this history. It was Japan itself, choosing to erase its own past in order to appear acceptable to the very Western powers that once threatened to colonize it. The persecution here wasn't tortures and executions. It was bureaucratic, quiet, efficient. A civilization deciding that an entire category of human love, one it had celebrated for centuries, no longer fit the image it wanted the world to see. And so the resolution to this story isn't a single man's fate. It's a culture's collective act of forgetting. The Wakashu tradition did not end in dramatic tragedy. No grand purge, no famous execution marks its closing chapter. It simply faded deliberately, methodically, out of official record, out of textbooks, out of the polished, sanitized image of the samurai that would later be exported to the world through film, through martial arts mythology, through the stoic, sexless warrior stereotype most of us grew up believing was historically accurate. Even the physical evidence suffered. Woodblock prints depicting shudō relationships, once mass-produced and openly sold, became targets for destruction or quiet suppression. Family records that once noted a young retainer's devoted companion without embarrassment were, in later generations, edited, reinterpreted, or simply left untranslated by scholars uncomfortable with what they revealed. What survives today survives mostly by accident, in temple archives too remote to have been cleaned up, in private collections that escaped official notice, in literary anthologies too famous to be quietly burned but still, for over a century, rarely translated into English or taught in Japanese schools. What that erasure reveals about the era, and about every era since, is this. The historical acceptance of same-sex love in feudal Japan was never permanent because it was never truly protected by anything beyond cultural convention. It existed at the pleasure of the social order, and when that order shifted, when new political incentives demanded a different national image, that acceptance could be, and was, switched off almost overnight by decree. That should challenge something in how we think about progress. We tend to imagine history as a straight line, moving steadily from persecution toward acceptance. Feudal Japan tells a stranger story, a society that normalized male love for centuries, then criminalized and buried it within a single lifetime, not because hearts and minds evolved, but because a government wanted a better reputation abroad. Acceptance, it turns out, can be undone as quickly as it was built, when it rests on custom rather than protection. So when you hear the word samurai, and the image in your head is a silent, disciplined warrior devoted only to sword and lord, know that you are picturing a Meiji-era public relations campaign, not the full historical truth. The true history includes blood oaths between men, poetry written for beloved companions, temples that blessed these bonds as sacred, and warlords who saw no contradiction between wielding a sword and writing a love letter to another man. Somewhere in an archive in Japan, faded scrolls still hold those letters. Most were never translated. Most were never meant to survive at all. And yet, here they are, centuries later, quietly waiting in climate-controlled rooms, in university collections, in temple storehouses, for someone curious enough to ask what they say, and honest enough to tell the story without softening it into something more comfortable for a modern audience. History does not just remember what happened. It remembers what someone, later,